Based on the ILO guidance and tools and on some selected best practices of different countries, this module deals with strategies to promote compliance, including the requirements and conditions to ensure labor regulations of good quality, and the alternatives to organize an adequate enforcement and sanctions system. This module aims to provide participants with information on designing strategies, activities, and approaches to promote and enforce compliance with the labor regulations. At the end of this module, participants will be able to understand the importance of legislation quality as a key factor in promoting compliance with labor legislation. Use methodologies to assess legislation and strategies to maximize the effectiveness of compliance. Describe strategies to improve the enforcement of labor legislation. Identify the key elements of the sanction systems and some alternatives modalities for sanctioning. Describe the role of social partners and other partner organizations in promoting compliance, especially among hard-to-reach groups of workers. First, we may question why the employers don't comply to laws and regulations. Compliance does not flow automatically from the mere existence of legislation, an inspection system, and threat of sanctions. Compliance with any particular legal requirement will be determined by a complex interplay of factors that are partly external to the government and partly arising from the actions of regulatory authorities. At least two factors we can focus on. 1. The capacity of labor administration to establish the necessary institutions and carry out the functions required for delivery of regulatory programs is fundamental. The administration should be able to clearly define the roles and responsibilities of its different institutions and make sufficient financial and human resources available for them. This means employing staff with necessary legal, technical, scientific skills, providing training and information for inspectors, and sufficient administrative, office and transport facilities for inspection and enforcement purposes. Finally, the whole administration should have an effective and modern institutional management system, covering human, financial, and information matters, including the collection and analysis of relevant data and information. 2. Social dialogue is vital to achieve compliance with the law. At a national level, there needs to be dialogue and negotiation between representatives of governments, employers and workers and other stakeholders, so as to reach agreement for improving compliance with labor issues at national, sectoral and enterprise levels. At the enterprise level, the same is necessary, though labor inspectors will not be involved in day-to-day dialogue between employers and their worker representatives. Nevertheless, the same model applies, so that all parties collaborate so as to ensure that minimum legal requirements are met and that, if possible, working conditions actually go beyond the law so as to provide decent working conditions for all. Studies show there are several factors that can contribute to non-compliance. We can summarize those into 8 causes. Failure to understand the law. This refers to a situation where the audience, who are expected to comply with the law, do not understand the provisions in laws. This could lead to non-compliance due to a lack of understanding or misinterpretation of the law. Collapse of belief in law. This refers to a situation where the audience has a belief that the laws cannot do justice, and as a result, they do not comply with the laws. This could happen if the laws are perceived to be biased or if the enforcement of the law is seen as ineffective or corrupt. Procedural injustice. This refers to a situation where there is a belief that the procedures involved in the legal process will lead to injustice. This could happen if the procedures are seen as unfair or if the legal process is perceived as biased. Cost of regulatory compliance. If the cost of compliance is too high, then some individuals or organizations may choose not to comply, which could lead to non-compliance. Deterrence failure. This refers to a situation where the punishment or penalty for non-compliance is not strong enough to deter individuals or organizations from breaking the law. This could result in continued non-compliance despite the existence of laws and regulations. Incapacitation of those regulated. This refers to a situation where the individuals or organizations that are regulated by the law are unable to comply due to various reasons such as lack of resources, lack of knowledge or expertise, or physical limitations. Failure of persuasion. This refers to a situation where the attempts to persuade individuals or organizations to comply with the law are not effective. This could happen if the communication strategies used are not appropriate or if the individuals or organizations do not trust the source of information. Failure of civil society. This refers to a situation where the civil society organizations that are expected to promote compliance with the law are unable to do so due to various reasons such as lack of resources, lack of knowledge or expertise, or political interference. Legislation should be clearly expressed and unambiguous to make it understandable by the target group and minimize the potential for differing interpretation. Be logically organized, coherent and consistent both internally and with other legal instruments. Include sufficient and suitable provisions for enforcement, both in terms of powers for inspectors and in terms of penalties that can be imposed. Make available any necessary information for its compliance on what will be necessary to implement them and on how that can be achieved. Structure of the regulatory system. Often different government departments are competent in different regulatory areas that are only vaguely distinct, such as in occupational health. In such cases, different regulations can overlap or even contradict one another. In other cases, an extension of or amendment to regulations takes place due to the pressures arising at a given time rather than to a well-designed plan laid down to develop a full and hierarchical regulatory corpus, thus giving rise to regulatory gaps or to the repetition in different texts of regulations with the same aim but not identical in form. All this creates confusion for the parties to whom liability is attached, sometimes causing a measure of legal uncertainty, and in any event making it harder to comply with obligations. To avoid this problem, there should be a single basic regulatory framework administered at a high political level that can serve as a context for any new labor regulations, setting down employers' general obligations and the rights and obligations of workers. To this can be added individual codes of regulations for specific risks or people groups and other non-mandatory codes of practice and guidance, as indicated above. In particular, technical standards are appropriate for inclusion in codes of practice or guidance, as these can be more easily changed and updated than legislation can be, such as when new technical data becomes available. Guides and handbooks also help duty holders and inspectors to implement and apply the law in practice. Dissemination of information. Drafting sound legislation is not enough on its own, and the government must also be able to make it work in practice. This requires sound labor and socio-economic systems, which will work together for the practical application of the legislation and the promotion of labor rights. There are important implications here for the enforcing authorities and also for less coercive tripartite, bipartite or independent organizations appointed to give advice and information, to help promote compliance with the law. The wide dissemination of information about what the legislation actually requires, via national gazettes, publications, websites and other means, will help duty holders, and this will be an important element of the overall strategy to promote compliance. Such dissemination is becoming easier as information technology systems develop and become more powerful, and are increasingly used by developing as well as by industrialized countries. More and more enterprises now have access to the Internet, and even the more remote labor inspectorate field offices are now being equipped with modern IT systems. But more needs to be done in this area. There are also many information and advisory service organizations, set up to support the labor inspectorates and to provide good advice to employers, workers and other stakeholders as to how best to meet legal requirements and promote best practice, which often goes beyond what the law requires. Such services are increasingly available online. These vary in the kinds of advice they provide. Some are private commercial organizations, while others are part of the government services for the wider implementation of decent work. Wider national or regional programs, campaigns, conferences and seminars are another increasingly popular means of promulgating information, and labor inspectors can have an active part to play in these initiatives even if they are not the principal driving force behind them. These activities may be multifaceted, that is, they comprise publicity about the law and what is required, conferences and seminars, regular meetings between key stakeholders, especially the government and its social partners, and, importantly in the present context, a targeted inspection program that matches the overall aims and foci of the programs and targets enforcement accordingly. Much has recently been written about information campaigns, such as those on safety and health, all with the aim of helping duty holders to understand what is legally required of them, where to find more information and to encourage them to comply. Some initiatives have specially targeted the self-employed and hard-to-reach groups using TV and the media. Nevertheless, there still remain significant differences across the working population as a whole, between people groups and sectors, in terms of the understanding of any given law and their motivation to comply. Differences are especially noticeable between small and large enterprises, as the text box below shows. Now we will look into strategies for enforcement of laws. The four central principles of regulation are: prioritization. This principle suggests that regulators should prioritize their efforts on the most significant risks to society. Regulators should focus on the risks that have the most severe consequences and allocate resources accordingly. Sustainability. This principle is concerned with the long-term sustainability of regulation. Regulators should aim to create regulations that are flexible and adaptable to changing circumstances. It is important to ensure that regulations do not become outdated or irrelevant. Deterrence. This principle is based on the idea that the threat of punishment or sanctions can be an effective deterrent to non-compliance. Regulators should ensure that the penalties for non-compliance are sufficient to deter individuals or organizations from breaking the rules. Systemic effects. This principle emphasizes the importance of considering the broader impacts of regulation on the economy and society as a whole. Regulators should consider the potential impacts of regulation on different sectors of society, and take steps to mitigate any negative effects. It is important to avoid unintended consequences that may arise from regulatory action. The sanctions approach is a deterrence-based system that makes extensive use of prosecution and litigation in order to deter violations. This approach seeks to influence employers' perception, high probability of inspection and detection of violations, and severity of penalties significant enough to lead enterprises to comply with the labor legislation. Critics with this approach say that it promotes adversarial relationships between regulators and the regulated, creates resentment and unwillingness in duty holders to cooperate, promotes a culture of defensiveness in enterprises, driving them to compliance and curing the symptoms, violations, instead of the underlying disease, weak or incooperative management. The compliance approach is based on the theory that compliance is best secured by persuasion rather than stringent enforcement. This approach to inspection is far more collaborative and allows inspectors to take a more flexible approach to compliance that involves helping employers to redress compliance problems. However, for persuasive actions to be effective, they must be supported by a genuine threat of enforcement and sanctions. The enforcement pyramid shown below represents a range of inspector actions, escalated in severity, to encourage compliance and to respond to non-compliance. As proposed by Ayres and Braithwaite, the more that sanctions can be kept in the background, the more regulation can be transacted through influence and persuasion, and the more effective regulation will be. Mixed approach. In practice, many inspectorates operate somewhere between the two approaches, trying to maintain good working relationships and social dialogue on one hand, but not neglecting to take enforcement action where they believe it to be justified. Levels of enforcement refer to the different approaches that can be used by regulatory bodies to ensure compliance with laws and regulations. The three levels of enforcement are: encouraging and assisting compliance. This level of enforcement focuses on providing guidance, education, and technical assistance to regulated entities to help them understand and comply with laws and regulations. It may include voluntary compliance programs, advisory services, and outreach efforts. Directing compliance. This level of enforcement involves more active monitoring and enforcement efforts to ensure compliance with laws and regulations. It may include inspections, audits, investigations, and other compliance monitoring activities. Regulators may issue warnings or notices of non-compliance and require corrective actions to be taken. Sanctions. This level of enforcement involves the use of penalties or punishments to deter non-compliance and ensure that regulated entities comply with laws and regulations. Sanctions may include fines, license revocations, criminal prosecutions, or other legal actions. Prioritization, sustainability, deterrence, and systemic effects are four central principles that guide the use of these different levels of enforcement. Prioritization refers to the need to focus enforcement efforts on the most significant risks to public health, safety, and the environment. Sustainability refers to the need to ensure that regulatory interventions are effective, efficient, and durable over time. Deterrence refers to the need to create strong incentives for compliance and to deter non-compliance through the threat of enforcement action. Systemic effects refer to the need to consider the broader social, economic, and environmental impacts of regulatory interventions. In practice, consistency on decisions about whether to give advice, impose sanction or to prosecute is not a simple matter, because inspectors are often faced with many variables. The level of hazard, the attitude and competence of management, and the history of incidents in a given enterprise. All these will vary from one enterprise to another, even in circumstances that may appear to be similar. These are some initiatives that can be taken to promote compliance. Workers' awareness and participation. Educating workers about their rights and responsibilities can encourage compliance. Workers can also be involved in reporting violations and monitoring compliance. Contractual requirements. Including compliance requirements in contracts with suppliers, contractors, and other stakeholders can ensure that compliance is a priority for all parties involved. Workplace audits. Regular audits can identify non-compliance issues and provide recommendations for improvement. Incentives. Providing incentives for compliance, such as bonuses or recognition, can encourage individuals and organizations to comply with regulations. A. Financial incentives. Providing financial rewards to those who comply with regulations can encourage compliance. B. Non-financial incentives. Offering non-financial rewards, such as public recognition or access to training and resources, can also promote compliance. Influencing informal economy and hard-to-reach groups. Strategies such as outreach programs, simplified compliance procedures, and peer support can help address non-compliance among informal economy workers and other hard-to-reach groups. Verbal or written warnings. This is the most common and least severe enforcement measure. It involves issuing a verbal or written warning to the offender, informing them of the violation and requesting them to comply with the law. Administrative directives or orders. This measure involves directing an individual or organization to comply with specific requirements set out in the law. Failure to comply with the directive or order can lead to more severe enforcement measures. Administratively imposed monetary penalties. This measure involves imposing a fine or penalty on an offender, which is administratively imposed by the enforcement agency rather than through the court system. Penalty notices, on-the-spot fines, and ticketing. This measure involves issuing a fine or penalty notice at the time of the violation, such as a traffic violation or littering. Increased regulatory burden. This measure involves increasing the regulatory burden on the offender to ensure compliance with the law. This could include requiring additional reporting, inspections, or audits. Negotiated solutions to non-compliance. This measure involves working with the offender to reach a mutually acceptable solution to the violation, such as a compliance agreement. Probation for companies and directors. This measure involves placing a company or its directors on probation, requiring them to comply with specific requirements or face more severe enforcement measures. Adverse publicity. This measure involves publicly naming and shaming the offender, potentially damaging their reputation and causing embarrassment. Contract listing. This measure involves excluding an offender from a list of preferred suppliers or contractors, potentially harming their business prospects. Disqualification of directors. This measure involves disqualifying a company director from holding any similar position in the future. Variations of licenses or conditions for enterprises. This measure involves varying the terms of a license or permit, potentially limiting the offender's ability to operate in a certain way. Civil and criminal prosecution. This measure involves taking legal action against the offender, potentially resulting in fines, imprisonment, or other penalties. The purpose of sanctions is to address the consequences of non-compliance with laws, regulations, or policies. Sanctions serve three primary purposes. Punishment. Sanctions are used to punish individuals or organizations that have violated laws or regulations. This punishment is intended to deter future violations and discourage others from engaging in similar behavior. Rehabilitation. Sanctions can also be used to rehabilitate individuals or organizations. This approach is designed to help violators understand the impact of their actions and to assist them in changing their behavior to prevent future violations. Restoration. Sanctions can also be used to restore harm caused by violations. For example, fines can be used to provide financial compensation to those harmed by violations, or remedial measures can be required to restore the environment or public safety. This approach focuses on restoring the harm caused by violations rather than punishing the violator. Share prompt. Determining the amount of fines is an important aspect of enforcement measures for promoting compliance. The primary purpose of fines is to act as a deterrent to future non-compliance. To achieve this, the amount of fines should be adjusted regularly to take into account inflation or changes in the economy. In some countries, the amount of penalties is linked to the minimum wage or is based on a multiplier of the wage. For instance, in Guatemala, inspectors have the authority to impose penalties ranging from 2 to 12 times the minimum wage, depending on the nature and severity of the violation. In Croatia, the method of fixing fines is based on confiscation of the profits derived from non-compliance. The amount of fines should also take into consideration the nature and consequences of the violation, such as the degree of harm caused, the intention of the violator, and the potential for future harm. If a violation is repeated, then the amount of the fine may need to be increased to act as a stronger deterrent. Another factor that may be considered when determining the amount of fines is the business turnover of the violator. If a company has a large turnover, then the fine may need to be higher to have a meaningful impact. Injunctions are legal orders issued by a court to force a duty holder to comply with labor legislation. This measure is usually taken by the labor inspectorate or directly by the inspector when non-compliance is identified. The injunction requires the duty holder to take specific action or to stop doing certain things in order to achieve compliance. The purpose of injunctions is to force compliance with the law, and they can be a powerful tool for the enforcement of labor legislation. Improvement notices are issued by the labor inspectorate when a breach of labor legislation is identified, but the breach is not serious enough to warrant prosecution. The notice sets out the specific steps the duty holder must take to rectify the breach within a specified time frame. The improvement notice is a formal way of informing the duty holder of the required action to be taken and serves as evidence of the inspector's engagement with the employer. Prohibition of work is an enforcement measure that is used when there is an immediate danger to the health and safety of workers. The Labor Inspectorate may issue a prohibition notice, which requires the duty holder to stop work or a particular activity until the danger is removed. Prohibition notices are used to prevent serious harm to workers and to ensure that employers take immediate steps to rectify the situation. They are only used in cases where there is an immediate danger and are a powerful tool for the enforcement of labor legislation. The T11 factors are divided into two groups: the Spontaneous Compliance Dimension Group and the Enforcement Dimension Group. The choice for this division has been made, because it is easiest to recognize the groups from the perspectives of compliance and enforcement. Spontaneous compliance dimensions, consisting of the target group's decisive motivations to comply with a rule, if no government control were to take place. T1. Knowledge of rules. The familiarity with and clarity of legislation among the target group. T2. Costs-benefits. The tangible, intangible advantages and disadvantages arising from compliance or non-compliance with the rules, expressed in time, money and effort. T3. Level of acceptance. The extent to which the policy and legislation is considered acceptable by the target group. T4. The target group's respect for authority. The extent to which the target group respects the government's authority. T5. Non-official control, social control. The risk, as estimated by the target group, of positive or negative sanctions on their behavior other than by the authorities. Enforcement dimensions which determine the risk of being caught in a government control and which determine the government's sanctioning policy. The perception of both influences the compliance behavior. T6. Risk of being reported. The risk, as estimated by the target group, of a violation detected by others than the authorities, being reported to a government body. T7. Risk of inspection. The risk, as estimated by the target group, of an inspection by the authorities as to whether rules are broken. T8. Risk of detection. The risk, as estimated by the target group, of a violation being detected in an inspection carried out by the authorities. T9. Selectivity. The perceived, increased risk of inspection and detection of a violation resulting from the selection of businesses, persons, actions or areas to be inspected. T10. Risk of sanction. The risk, as estimated by the target group, of a sanction being imposed if an inspection reveals that a rule has been broken. T11. Severity of sanction. The severity and nature of the sanction associated with the violation and additional disadvantages of being sanctioned. Thank you for attending. You may now raise any question or comment.